This video is brought to you by Blinkist. The first 100 people to go to blinkist.com/biographics will get 1 week to try it out for free. You'll also get 25% off the cost of full membership. More on them in a bit. You probably know the old saying, some are born to greatness, while others have greatness thrust upon them. During the years we've been making these videos, we've covered hundreds of men and women who fall into both categories. We've even covered plenty of people for whom greatness meant doing something consequential but awful, your Stalins and your Maos. But what about those whose destiny isn't to be anywhere close to greatness? Those who were born to, or had mediocrity thrust upon them, only for that mediocrity to itself alter history. For Charles Cornwallis, this wasn't an abstract question. It was his very life. Born into the English upper classes, Cornwallis had the misfortune of embarking on a military career just as England's American colonies exploded in revolt. Promoted above his head and shipped out to fight, he wound up being the Redcoats' commander at Yorktown, where his surrender ended the Revolutionary War and ensured Britain forever lost her 13 colonies. In today's video, we're examining the life of a mostly decent but a useless man. A useless man who somehow still managed to change the world. When Charles Cornwallis was born on December 31st, 1738, it was into a family that was spectacularly well connected. His grandfather was brother-in-law of the great Robert Walpole, while his father would soon be made both an earl and a viscount. The family also stood in good grace with the monarchy. Despite likely having Cornish-Irish roots, the Cornwallises were famously loyal to the British throne. It was a trait that Charles would inherit and one that would land him in a lot of trouble. For now, though, young Charles enjoyed a regulation childhood among the English upper classes, attending Eton with future dukes and learning about military glory. The boy evidently liked what he learned. As a teenager, his fascination with war was intense, even by the standards of the time. Despite having a body shape we might charitably call unlike Chris Hemsworth and suffering skewed vision from a sporting injury, Cornwallis was determined to one day fight for king and country. That day came sooner than he expected. In August 1756, just as Charles was enrolling at Cambridge, Frederick the Great of Prussia invaded Saxony. For the past 2 years, America's British and French colonists had been fighting one another in the French and Indian War. Frederick the Great's attack on a French ally in Europe was the opening of a whole new theatre of combat. With Britain now allied with Prussia in this increasingly global conflict, Charles decided to ditch his studies and become the soldier that he'd always dreamed of being. From 1757 to 1761, Charles Cornwallis toured Europe with the Prussian army, fighting in some of the biggest battles of his era. And he clearly made an impression. By the end, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel. Even before the fighting finished, he was able to translate his military glory into a seat in Britain's House of Commons. Not that he'd need it for very long. In June 1762, his father died, and Charles inherited his earldom. A year later, as the 7 Years' War finally drew to a close, he took his dad's seat in the House of Lords. Long a byword for stuffy conservatism, the Lords nonetheless had a handful of liberal-ish members even in Cornwallis's day. Known as the Rockinghamites after their leader Lord Rockingham, they managed to recruit the new earl just as politics got very interesting. Being on the winning side of the 7 Years' War had been great for Britain's standing, but it had been terrible for its finances. Since expelling the French from America had primarily benefited the 13 colonies, it was decided the colonists could refill the king's coffers. And so we come to the infamous Stamp Act. A tax on all paper and printed materials in the colonies. The Stamp Act was kind of like George III personally slapping every American about the face with a bit of a frilly glove. It was also the stupidest thing that Cornwallis had ever heard of. In the Lords, Cornwallis became a passionate enemy of the Stamp Act, believing it unfair on the Americans. When Lord Rockingham became Prime Minister and repealed the act, Cornwallis was one of those who cheered the loudest. But Rockingham also passed the Declaratory Act, which basically said to the Americans, okay, fine, we won't tax you now, but we absolutely have the right to. Only 5 peers voted against this new, also dumb law. Among them was Charles Cornwallis. Yet while he cared about all this, politics wasn't Charles Cornwallis's lifeblood. It wasn't what made him get out of bed in the morning. In 1768, he was ready to retire from the Lords and settle down with his new wife, Jemima. This would be the happiest period of his life. Jemima was the daughter of a soldier, far below Cornwallis's class, but had married her for love, and the two soon settled into a blissful and boring domestic life. As the years passed and the two became parents and grew fat, it's just about possible to see how things could have turned out differently. A world in which Charles Cornwallis was only ever an obscure happy nobody. But unfortunately, Charles did not live in that world. In this world, he was destined to not be forgotten, but to go down in infamy. While Charles Cornwallis was happily slipping into retirement, the British government was happily pouring gasoline onto the Stamp Act dumpster fire. Just a year after the Declaratory Act, the Townshend Act had slapped duties on British exports to the colonies. This had led to a boycott on British goods, which had in turn led to British soldiers being sent to Boston, culminating in the Boston Massacre when soldiers fired into a mob, killing 5. In the wake of this, Parliament had repealed the Townshend Act and decided to stop levying unfair taxes on the Americans once and for all. Not really. You are vaguely familiar with history. That, of course, didn't happen. Instead, you had the Tea Act of 1773, which led to the Boston Tea Party, and then the Intolerable Acts, by which point the 13 colonies had basically become a bit of a powder keg. Finally, on April the 18th, 1775, British troops lit the match by marching out to seize weapons held in Concord. En route, they bumped into a waiting militia in Lexington, someone fired a shot, and the rest is history that you're familiar with. Okay, so now we've recapped 3rd grade American history class, it's time to check back in on Cornwallis. Despite having been Parliament's guy most likely to make love heart signs at America, the moment the revolution broke out, Cornwallis defaulted back to his king and country mode. Although his wife begged him not to, he volunteered to fight and was promoted to Major General and shipped out on February the 12th, 1776. On May the 3rd, his ship made landfall in North Carolina. At this point in the story, Cornwallis met his lifelong nemesis, Sir Henry Clinton. The man who would eventually head all the British forces in the colonies, Clinton was a sensitive, moody, envious, incompetent, entitled screw-up of commander. From almost the moment they met, Clinton and Cornwallis regarded one another with a mutual loathing, a loathing that would eventually deteriorate into outright hostility. But in those early days, the British could still pretend that this was just teething problems. As Cornwallis was sent north to reinforce Sir William Howe in New York, it even looked like the war might be over before it properly began. That summer, Cornwallis commanded the reserve troops in the Battle of Long Island, a cataclysmic defeat that saw George Washington lose New York City to the British. Although William Howe let the American general slip through his fingers, Cornwallis was certain they'd catch him soon. Unfortunately, it quickly became clear that slipping through fingers was something Washington was rather good at. The next 6 months of Cornwallis's life reads like the synopsis for a rejected Roadrunner cartoon in which Wile E. Coyote briefly commands a major part of the British Army. There was the Battle of Fort Lee in November, which ended with Cornwallis forced to chase the slippery Washington all over the state. Then there was Cornwallis's inexplicable decision to let Washington go after finally catching up with him, a moment that may have cost the British the war. Finally, there was what happened at Trenton on January the 2nd, 1777. After marching a whole day to catch Washington, Cornwallis allowed his men to sleep rather than immediately ford a creek and do battle. Stupidly, he forgot to post lookout, so Washington simply waited until nightfall and then roadrunnered away again, leaving Cornwallis's reputation to plunge, Wile E. Coyote-like, into a bottomless pit. When Clinton got the news of this blunder, he remarked it was the most consummate ignorance I ever heard of in any officer above a corporal. As we'll soon see, though, Clinton was himself no slouch at ignorance, and Cornwallis also did at least have one thing going for him. Throughout all the wars he'd ever been involved with, the Earl would do his best to make sure his men were well fed, paid on time, and not made to suffer. It's here that we see one of these sad contradictions of Cornwallis's life. Up to a certain point, he was a competent man with a humane streak, rare for his class. Had he been a bit less privileged, he would have made a fine logistics commander or lower-ranking officer. But this was the 18th century, an era in British history when background was valued above ability. Poor old Charles Cornwallis was going to keep failing upwards until it killed him. And as you know, perhaps old Cornwallis might have failed a little less if he had quick and easy access to the greatest wisdom of his time. He didn't have blinkers because it was the 18th century and books were still being written with feathers back then, but you have no excuse. Look, if you're like me, you've got plans to read lots of new books this year because, well, you want to add to that sweet bank of knowledge that you keep in your big brain. Unfortunately, reading takes time and energy and attention, all things that we're all lacking. Fortunately, though, I have Blinkist. This is an app that offers easily digestible 15-minute summaries of the best non-fiction books. There's more than 3,000 of them. You can either read or listen. Personally, I listen about 90% of the time, just like a podcast. It's easier to fit into my day that way while doing mindless things like going to work or cleaning the kitchen or folding the laundry, that sort of stuff. 14 million active users are currently using Blinkist to get the best insights and need-to-know info from thousands of books, from self-help to business to health. Whatever you're into, it's on there. For example, on my Blinkist list for 2021, I have How Luck Happens by Janice Kaplan and Barnaby Marsh. It's a whole book on how to create luck for yourself, distilled down into a 13-minute package. So if you're interested in learning big ideas in small packages, head to blinkist.com/biographics, where the first 100 people will get 1 week to try it out for free. You'll also get 25% off if you want the full membership. And let's get back to Cornwallis. Comic as the image is of Cornwallis as some kind of doofus cartoon coyote, we don't want you to go away thinking he was completely useless. The key takeaway is that he was average, an average guy in a position that required someone well above average. But even the mediocre have occasional moments of greatness. Cornwallis's came at the Battle of Brandywine. Brandywine is notorious today as Washington's biggest screw-up, but from the British perspective, it was a triumph. Taking place on September the 11th, 1777, it saw William Howe and Cornwallis launch a dual attack on Washington's troops under the cover of fog. Assuming Howe's division was the entire British force, Washington left his right flank clear open, only for Cornwallis to come crashing into it. The Continental Army suffered over 1,100 casualties compared to just 600 for the British. Although Washington again roadrunnered away, he lost all of his artillery pieces and Philadelphia, which now lay wide open. For Cornwallis, the sneak attack was a huge personal victory. He was even allowed time off that Christmas to go home and see his wife. We can only hope he enjoyed it, because that Christmas would be the last normal one that Charles ever spent with his family. The following winter, Jemima was taken ill. She died on February the 16th, 1779. Thanks to emergency leave, Cornwallis made it home just in time to see her. But with the war still raging, he had no time to mourn. Instead, he had to pack back up and return to America. His domestic life in England's no longer something to look forward to, just a happy memory, one of happier times. Back in the colonies, the war was moving inexorably against the British. The French and Spanish were now involved. The Americans had refused to surrender after Philadelphia fell, and Henry Clinton was now overall British commander, with predictably cruddy results. So Cornwallis decided to change tack. In May 1780, he headed into South Carolina at the head of a vast fighting force, determined to open a new front. Charlestown fell quickly, as did other key strategic points. Before long, Cornwallis had effectively taken control of the entire state. When General Gates attempted to retake the town of Camden for the Continentals, Cornwallis even managed to win another great victory, killing or capturing nearly 2,000 Americans, while losing only 300 of his own men. Come fall of 1780, Cornwallis was secure in South Carolina. Had it been his dream to rule the state as a warlord, he would have been pretty happy. But of course, that hadn't been Cornwallis's goal. He wanted to take North Carolina too, then march into Virginia and link up with Clinton's army. Like so many dreams, it would prove to be beyond Charles Cornwallis's reach. North Carolina was not South Carolina. The mini-civil war between patriots and loyalists was more bitter here, the terrain less friendly. In January 1781, the Battle of Cowpens saw many of Cornwallis's best soldiers killed or captured. 2 months later, Cornwallis squared off against Nathanael Greene at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse and managed to rack up a technical victory that cost so many of his remaining soldiers that you might as well call it a defeat. By now, the great victory at Brandywine must have seemed like very long ago. Even the Battle of Camden was 3/4 of a year past. Still, Cornwallis gamely pushed on, marching up into Virginia, despite North Carolina not yet being pacified. In May of 1781, his exhausted men finally reached the James River, at which point they received the fateful order. A message from Clinton came demanding Cornwallis establish a fortified base at either Williamsburg or Yorktown. As far as Cornwallis was concerned, this was like Clinton asking him to choose between a kick in the nuts and a rectally inserted cactus. Neither was particularly pleasant to contemplate. But orders were orders. With what we can only imagine was a pained sigh, the Earl chose the kick in the nuts that was Yorktown. Little did poor Charles Cornwallis know it, but he'd soon be wishing he'd chosen the prickly, comforting cactus in Williamsburg instead. The moment Cornwallis settled in Yorktown, the Revolutionary War was basically over. The French and most of the Americans immediately realized the British were sitting ducks. Although Washington initially ignored it as a sideshow, he eventually realized its significance. The only person who never figured it out was Henry Clinton. Ensconced in New York, Clinton was certain Washington was going to attack him, so certain that when he received a pathetic plea from Cornwallis begging for more troops, he ignored it. But Washington was already making plans to head south for the final battle. On September the 28th, the combined American-French force began its assault on Yorktown. As the siege trenches were dug and the artillery began, Cornwallis sat tight, barely bothering to give orders. It's possible he thought Clinton was coming to rescue him, or he may have just realized how hopeless his position was. On October the 14th, the first assault began. In his last act of competence, Cornwallis began ferrying his men to safety across the James River. He got 1,000 of them over before a storm blew up and rendered it impassable. Escape cut off, there was nothing to do but wait for the end. At 11 a.m. on October the 19th, 1781, the British surrendered Yorktown. It was, frankly, pathetic end. As the Redcoats marched out, they acknowledged the French battalions, but ignored the American troops. Cornwallis himself refused to meet Washington for the formal surrender, instead sending an assistant. It was a cheap, last-minute snub. But it didn't change the fact that the man he was snubbing had just handed Cornwallis his arse. Yorktown ended the Revolutionary War thanks to a combination of Clinton's poor leadership and Cornwallis's painfully mediocre performance. The British were knocked out of the fight. Of course, the wind had been blowing in that direction for a very long time. It's not like Cornwallis was single-handedly responsible for the British losing the war. But he also didn't do much to help them win. Had he been just a bit more talented, a bit more daring, a bit more, well, anything really, well, over 6 years of fighting, that could have really added up. A few more Brandywines here, another Camden there, and the history of America might look very different. Despite his major role in losing the 13 colonies, though, Cornwallis didn't return to Britain under a cloud of shame. The view in London was that he was a good, loyal soldier, and more importantly, a gentleman, one who'd been put in an impossible position. All of which is why, within 7 months of the disaster at Yorktown, Charles Cornwallis was offered military control of British India. I know, right? This guy's literally just proven himself to be super unexcellent at this, and here's the British establishment being all like, yeah, want to try something even bigger? I mean, why not? At least Cornwallis himself had the brains to say no, something he kept saying for 4 whole years. You can't have people falling upwards without the complicity of everyone else, though. In February of 1786, after years of cajoling by Prime Minister Pitt the Younger, Cornwallis finally agreed. He had only one request. Still smarting about Clinton's dumb orders, Cornwallis demanded he be given total control of the subcontinent, and Pitt agreed. So, rather than retiring into obscurity, Cornwallis sailed off for India. So, would it go any better than America did? Well, what do you think? The India Charles Cornwallis arrived in was undergoing a seismic change in its relationship with Britain. Until recently, the East India Company had almost free reign over its territories. It was in 1784 that Pitt the Younger made the company formally subservient to the crown. As such, British rule was riven with corruption and beset by local warring sultans. And it was Cornwallis's job to sort it all out. His success would be qualified, to say the least. For Cornwallis, corruption was synonymous with natives, so he decided to kick them all out of the colonial administration. Declaring every native of Hindustan, I really believe, is corrupt, Cornwallis enacted laws that effectively created an all-white governing class. Up until recently, India had been a colonial enterprise, but one in which Indians could at least attain important positions. Cornwallis changed all of that. A new glass ceiling stopped locals rising above the most minor roles in the civil service, while Indian police units were brought under British control. Meanwhile, Cornwallis castigated any white officer who he deemed had formal connections with the worst black people in Bengal. On the flip side, he did at least try to promote the learning of native languages among British officials, but compared to everything else, that's a fairly faint silver lining. There's also the matter of the Third Anglo-Mysore War. Unlike the American Revolutionary War, this war with the Tipu Sultan of Mysore ended in a Cornwallis victory. In 1790, the Sultan started raiding around the edges of British territory. Cornwallis personally took control of the response, and by April of 1791, he had taken the Mysore city of Bangalore. But the war dragged on another year, in part because Cornwallis refused to trust Britain's Indian allies, leading to an unnecessary prolonging of the fighting. When he finally did make peace in February of 1792, it was with a treaty seemingly calculated to please absolutely nobody. The Sultan was upset because he had to cede half his territory, while London was unhappy Cornwallis hadn't held out for the whole lot. Still, at least defeating Tipu took some of the stench of failure that was left over from Yorktown. And Cornwallis was certain that this wasn't going to be his last war. In February of 1793, France, then in the grip of revolution, declared war on Britain. With his term expiring and certain that he'd be needed to prepare England against a French invasion, Cornwallis returned home, stopping only to annex French Pondicherry on the way. But although he was made head of the home front, Charles wouldn't make his final mark on history fighting the French. Well, not exactly. Instead, he was destined to spend one last frustrating chapter of his life trying to pacify Ireland. At the time, Ireland was in a personal union with Britain, but not a political one. They had the same king, but were separate countries, Sort of like how today Canada and the UK both have Elizabeth II as their head of state, but the Canadians fortunately don't have to have Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. However, the islands of the 1790s had only just gained autonomy from Britain, and no one was adjusting well to the new state of affairs. The Catholics, who made up about 90% of the population, wanted to go further and establish a French-style republic. The Protestant minority, who were 10% of the population but held all the power, wanted to hew closer to Britain and also just kill as many Catholics as possible. When this erupted into the United Irishmen Rebellion in May 1798, London freaked out that the French would help their fellow Catholics and establish a foothold on Britain's doorstep. Their solution, well, that was to send Charles Cornwallis to quell the rebellious Irish. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? In the end, Cornwallis' career fighting Irish rebels ended before it even started. He landed in Dublin on June the 21st, 1798, only for the rebels to be effectively knocked out of the war before it even finished unloading. All that was left to do, from a military perspective, was to defeat the small French force that landed in August. But while the war was easily won, the peace would be a nightmare. Cornwallis' remit in Ireland basically boiled down to, well, go and sort out this annoying island once and for all, old chap. However, that was easier said than done. Although London had likely envisioned Cornwallis using his broad powers to kick a few Catholics in the testicles, the Earl soon came to believe that the rebellious Catholics weren't actually the problem. It was the Protestant rulers who were tearing Ireland apart. With Catholics in the vast majority, the only way the Protestants could have any importance was by locking their countrymen out of power, and doing that required convincing themselves that the Catholic Irish were subhuman. Cornwallis was aghast at leading Protestants celebrating the murder of priests. He grew to blame the bloodthirsty loyalists for the whole sorry war, and even began trying to build personal links with the Catholic communities to sort the mess out. Unfortunately, his chosen method would be very controversial. Not long after defeating the French expeditionary force, Cornwallis had made friends with the then acting Secretary of Ireland, Viscount Castlereagh. An Ulsterman, Castlereagh was the island's leading proponent of reconciliation, but had convinced himself that dragging Ireland into union with Great Britain was the only route to Catholic emancipation. Now he managed to convince Cornwallis of this too. The trouble was, a truly independent Ireland with equal rights would be a Catholic bastion in Northern Europe, one the French would no doubt ally with. But to leave things as they are risked an Ireland ruled by Protestant tyrants who repeatedly triggered civil wars and then demanded London protect them. No, the only future Cornwallis could see was one where Ireland joined with Great Britain and Catholics were emancipated and protected by the benevolent majesty of George III. As any American who still remembered the Stamp Act would tell you, this was never going to work. Nonetheless, Cornwallis and Castlereagh began a determined push to make the union happen. It was a grueling 2 years. First, they had to convince the Protestants, who feared their own power being curtailed and demanded massive bribes to vote it through. Second, they had to convince the Catholics that this would be a new, brighter chapter in their history and not just an excuse for London to, oh, I don't know, brutally exacerbate a potato famine several decades down the line, killing millions. Finally, they had to convince the British cabinet that tying Catholic emancipation to the Act of Union was both fair and just. To Cornwallis' surprise, they succeeded. The cabinet was all like, sure, we'll oppress them a bit less afterwards. But then the union actually got voted through, and the cabinet were all like, haha, just joking. Let's oppress the shit out of them. On January the 1st, 1801, Ireland and Great Britain formally joined into a single state. That same month, King George III declared there would never be any relief or increased rights for Catholics. Shortly after, ill, exhausted, and miserable, Charles Cornwallis resigned. Privately, he raged against the mule-headed stupidity that would allow Britain to persevere in the old system of prescription and exclusion in Ireland. But publicly, well, Cornwallis was still all about king and country, remember? He accepted the settlement, and then he packed his bags and returned home. And that was pretty much it for the Earl. Although he would play a role negotiating peace with Napoleon after the War of the Second Coalition in 1802, the wind seems to have been sucked out of his sails by the Ireland debacle. He went back into retirement, perhaps determined to enjoy the quiet life that he and his wife had briefly known all those years earlier. But in this era, even failure and retirement couldn't stop the Crown from forcing you into service. In July 1805, Cornwallis was ordered to return to India. He didn't want to go, but he felt he couldn't refuse. Sadly, it was the wrong choice. Not long after landing, Charles Cornwallis contracted a tropical fever. He died on October the 5th, thousands of kilometers from the country that he had served so dutifully. Today, the most striking thing about Cornwallis's life is how much of it he spent in over his head. In America, he was fighting a war he didn't really believe in, while totally outwitted. In India, he was tasked with solving intricate problems using only the blunt hammer of racial apartheid. And in Ireland, well, let's just say he was too trusting of his own arsehole king. It's not to Cornwallis's detriment that we bring these up. They are problems that would have befuddled someone with 10 times the talent. But that's sort of the point. Charles Cornwallis was not a talented man. He was mostly mediocre, with occasional flashes of humanity or brilliance that were too few and too far between. Had he just stayed in retirement with Jemima in 1775, he would have been completely forgotten by history. But how much happier his life could have been, how different the fates of millions. The story of Charles Cornwallis is both the tale of a moderately decent man who failed upwards and a damning indictment of his time. A time when who your parents were mattered more than your capabilities. Cornwallis may have had the soldier's life he'd always dreamed of, but as his story shows, it sometimes may be better when our dreams don't come true. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching.